Hi, everyone. Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Blair Embry. I use she, her pronouns, and welcome to the Prison Yoga Project podcast. We are absolutely honored and really excited today to have our amazing guest, Dr. Michael Yellowbird, and I would love to do a formal introduction of him and his work. Dr. Michael Yellowbird works with tribal and indigenous peoples to bring mindfulness and neurodecolonization approaches to these communities for healing and to improve wellness. He uses neuroscience research to examine how mindfulness approaches and traditional indigenous contemplative practices can train the mind and positively change the structure and function of the brain. He studies how experiences and perceptions change the brain, neuroplasticity, shape our DNA, and affect the expression of our genes, activate different brain regions, change our brain waves, and shape specialized brain cells such as mirror neurons and alter our neurotransmitters and modulators. Dr. Michael Yellowbird uses his work to translate the neuroscience of mindfulness and neurodecolonization to tribal and indigenous communities so that they can understand why and how mindfulness and indigenous contemplative practices work. He has held faculty appointments in schools of social work at the University of British Columbia, University of Kansas, Arizona State University, and Humboldt State University. He was the director of Tribal and Indigenous People Studies program at North Dakota State University. He is presently the Dean of Faculty of Social Work at the University of Manitoba of Canada. Thank you so much for joining us.
Glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah. And would you lead us in a little centering or a mindfulness moment before we dive in?
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for the wonderful invitation as well as the wonderful introduction. So I'd like to just go ahead and start with everybody just kind of assuming the positions I say and finding your space, finding your place, kind of locating yourself where you're at right now. And just for a moment, if you feel comfortable, you can close your eyes, put your hands in your laps or wherever feels most comfortable. And maybe for the first time today, just feel how it feels to breathe or to be breathed by your breath. And again, just paying attention to how your feet feel on touching the floor or your legs, your bottoms feel touching your chair. How does it feel to have your arms connected to your shoulders and relaxing on your lap? And just sitting up as straight as possible, not too rigidly, will help bring awareness to this moment. And you can shift just gently to think about where you're sitting now. Maybe you can visualize yourself getting on a horse, centering yourself, sitting in the middle of the chair and getting ready to drive, leaning back just slightly. And creating a safe place in your bubble of awareness now, your space of awareness as you cleanse with each in-breath, cleansing your space with each out-breath. Again, cleansing on the in-breath, pausing slightly, and then on the out-breath, cleansing the space. For a moment, allow yourself to draw in all the energies of this space that you've now created. All the life here, all the understanding, all the wisdom that exists in this place. And give yourself permission to enjoy this moment, to bring in this moment, to raise your level of clarity, connection. And as you are centered, just allow yourself to visualize breathing in to all the people on this call and breathing back out to them, exchanging in this way the flow of life, the breath of life. Notice where that breath is going, entering the nostrils, down the throat, into the windpipe, into the body, circulating in the body, returning out, connected to other breath that we're all breathing at this time. Creating this large breath, this large moment of breathing, this flow of life. Taking a nice deep breath in, breathing in, breathing in, breathing in, pausing, releasing, breathing out, breathing out, and breathing out. Noticing the body's acceptance of this breath, purifying of this breath, the grounding of this breath. Always coming back to the breath as the anchor, as the point of enlightenment and understanding. And now breathing outside of this bubble, deeply into the lands, to this space, into the air, and to all the ancestors that are always available to us, our relatives, the earth, the air. And the waters. And just feel how it feels to be breathed by all of these sentient entities that exist. And again, exchanging breath with all, breathing in, breathing in, breathing in, giving breath, breathing out, breathing out, breathing out. And now slightly shifting your awareness and your attention to gently and deliberately returning to the space, the awareness of this time, of the room and the place that you're in. Hearing the sounds, feeling the sensations. And slowly and gently, when you're ready, opening the eyes, holding your gaze just for a moment, coming back to awareness. When you're ready. Right, be sure to drink water today.
Thank you for this really impactful centering and calling in the land and our ancestors. So, I've been thinking of how to start this conversation, and I think it might be valuable for all of us to have a shared language. So, maybe we start kind of big and then go a little bit smaller. And for shared language, I'm thinking that so, what is colonization and how is it still impacting our systems, our mentality, and the way that we live?
So are you asking folks generally, or are you asking me? Or
I'm asking you. Yeah.
oh, okay.
We'll dive
Yes.
into we'll dive into a question and answer later. So we'll just you and I just get to chat for 30 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the way that I think about um, uh, colonization is how it's manifest in you know the idea of conquest and exploitation. And colonization can be conquest of the mind, conquest of the body, manipulation of the mind, manipulation of the body, moving us in spaces that are spaces that take us away from our centeredness, our groundedness, our familiarity of who we are and how we interact and engage in the world in the healthy and balanced ways. Um, I think about colonization really is this unwelcome intrusion, that comes externally from people, from external, forces that are their aim is to control and manipulate, to extract, to exploit, right? And then after that period of invasion, that's happening to us in our brains and our bodies and our communities on the planet. There's a period of contamination where toxic and harmful contact and interactions occur. Toxic talk, toxic symbols, toxic language, toxic ideas, beliefs, and values that can begin to contaminate our connection to one another, our connection to Earth, our environment, and our lineage as well. After the contamination period of colonization, there's a period that I refer to as the infection stage, where our bodies and our brains and our everything about us, our cells and our genes, our genetic profiles begin to become overwhelmed, from this toxic talk and toxic experience and contamination, and where our immunity system, our psychological, emotional, spiritual immunity begins to be overwhelmed, and death and sickness begin to set in. It causes all kinds of different diseases, whether they be emotional, spiritual, physical, any of those kinds of diseases. And it's not until that point happens, when we are kind of at our lowest state, that colonization then begins to take root, meaning that if we survive these first three phases of colonization, we become colonized. The ideas, the beliefs, the values, the practices of colonization all become part of our lives. And once they do, and we begin to learn how to live in those spaces, those liminal spaces, which sometimes are very unhealthy, we no longer become that overwhelmed by the colonization. We can actually function in a colonized world. Some can thrive within a colonial state, but yet others, many people remain very vulnerable to that kind of thing. Those of us who are privileged have less of an impact, from that kind of colonization. Those that are very marginalized and find themselves to be very vulnerable are the most affected by colonization. So,
Thank you. How can we track colonization? I feel like this might be like a little bit of a homework piece so that when we get off the webinar, people can start to shift their perspective. But how can we track colonization in our life?
yeah. So one of the things that I've done in my work, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I'm writing about that, is decolonization. And I think about it in terms of mindfulness and contemplative practices, in terms of, we have to begin to understand the level of colonization that's taken root. So in decolonization, I have a big circle in my model that says the cleansing or purification period, which requires us to engage in practices that really are aimed at stripping away the harmful, the invasive, thoughts and practices, beliefs and values that have been imposed by these colonizing structures, entities, these processes that exist outside of ourselves. So it's sometimes, in mindfulness practice, they say, well, the content is there. You pay attention to the content, and then go back to your breathing. I like to say that when those themes continue to arise, that's the understanding that these are the pieces of colonization that continue to, manifest in the brain, and have manifested in the body, and continue to kind of offline us, and make us vulnerable. So that's the cleansing part that we do. We develop practices that help strip away those kinds of things. The next phase of decolonization that I talk about a lot is the Renaissance period, the period of restoration of cultural beliefs, practices, thinking, and values that were taken away during the period of colonization, or they were abandoned. People were forced to abandon them, but they're relevant and necessary for survival and well-being. And what are those kinds of things that would emerge from the Renaissance? And I think we're seeing that now, especially among Indigenous groups, where people are returning to stories, to songs, to dances, to symbols, to ideas, to prayers, and even prophecies that have held Indigenous people, very securely, and kind of kept us moving in that kind of line to know that there's always going to be these bumps and these uncertainties and these challenges and vulnerabilities in life, and those a big part of them are influenced by the level of colonization. But there are things that we need to draw from them that will bring about survival, that will bring about our thrival as well, and also well-being. So that's the next period of decolonization. And there are practices that we engage in that help bring us back to that point as we engage deeply into some of the songs and the prayers and the ideas. And part of the practice that I did earlier was kind of drawing in from the lands and drawing in from the ancestors, which is common among some of the tribes I come from. The last phase then is the period called the Enlightenment period, that I refer to as the Enlightenment period and decolonization. And it's really an understanding that we, in order to become enlightened, we have to birth new ideas, new thinking, new technologies, and lifestyles that are going to be able to contribute to the advancement and again the empowerment of Indigenous people is what I kind of have focused on. And those kinds of things that we sort of gravitate to in terms of birthing new ideas and thinking and technologies are really about creating another level of creativity, an ability to kind of see beyond ourselves and begin to engage in creative acts that are courageous and that are transforming and transformational, I should say, of the societies we live in. So it really challenges us to kind of move in through cleansing, bringing back those practices through a renaissance and a restoration, and of course the enlightenment about where do we go from here. So we're not living in the liminal space all the time, but we're actually engaged in life in a very healthy way and not just sitting on our cushions.
Thank you. It's really intimate and expansive threefold process that you have outlined. You also, your work is neurodecolonization. Can you talk about how colonization has impacted our brains over centuries, and then and how we unwind that?
Yeah, so like one of my contributions has been around neurodecolonization, and it's understanding that as you mentioned earlier, neuroplasticity, that the experiences and the perceptions that we pick up, from traumatic, oppressive experiences actually change the brain's structure and function, and that's part of the neuroplasticity. As different parts of the brain begin to be overactive, right? Like in the amygdala, they call it the hijacking of the amygdala now. It's kind of some words some people use, but the amygdala has always been active for us, right? And the other part, the triune part of our brain, the fight, the flight, the fearing, and the feeding kinds of part of our brain, the basic kinds of things we need to do. And it's really important, in order to understand, neurodecolonization, is that the brain that we have, a lot of science will tell us that we've been incubating and developing this for 400 million years, until we developed spines and we evolved to who we are today. 400 million years of practice of the fighting, flighting, feeding, fornicating, and fearing, and those kinds of things, right? So that's really a strong pull that we have. On the other side of it, the flip side of it, in the brain, we have neurons of compassion that lived in another part of the brain. I'll just grab my brain. I'll grab my brain here, and kind of live somewhere here in the anterior cingulate cortex, right? And that part of the brain, is where there are neurons of compassion that exist, and we can access those. They're loving, but it takes, they're only 17 million years old. So although that may seem like a long time that we've been caring and nurturing and raising our level of oxytocin to kind of, to kind of continue to bond, as well as to kind of be responsible for that kind of behavior, that which is compassionate and loving behavior. A lot of times it gets overridden by that older part of the brain that's been around much longer, that we spend a lot of time practicing. So when we have trauma and colonization, then it overactivates, that amygdala part of the brain. There's less activation, maybe in the anterior cingulate cortex. There's less activation in the part of the brain called the insula, which is really kind of about helping us to control our level of emotional regulation and negativity. So neurodecolonization really takes that into consideration, and about how our environment also triggers, epigenetically, fears and joy and hope and negativity, that sort of thing. That kind of epigenetic part of our environment either triggers or silences our gene expression, which in some cases is very good if you want to silence some genes that are very harmful genes or problematic genes, or it can turn on genes that are inflammatory that can lead to different kinds of diseases, emotional disorders, things like anxiety disorders and depression. Depression is what some people consider to be, among a lot of indigenous groups, a very novel disease. Neurodecolonization is very interested in how, as you mentioned earlier, it alters our neurotransmitters and modulators. For instance, we know that there's a modulator in our brain called Lynx-1, like the animal lynx, LYNX, the number 1, that kind of keeps the brain from, it keeps the brain, what we know inside, right? And it's a little hard to, as more and more we get older, as more we get rigid, Lynx-1 kind of, it keeps a lot of information out and keeps what we learn in. So it's important that, that we just don't think about, the experience of colonization being a victim, but how we have to believe that, we're stronger than the colonization, that we can overcome the colonization, that we can adapt, and be creative in colonization in order to kind of silence colonization. Otherwise, that neuromodulator like Lynx-1 then kind of keeps out those kinds of new learnings. So there's a lot of complexity, in the brain that's happening all the time. So neurodecolonization likes to consider that, and it considers like all of these different kinds of things that sort of affect us, right? And that when we engage in contemplative practices that are what I call now like Western mindfulness practices and indigenous contemplative practices, we can use those then to begin to open those ways to begin to shift, our experiences and perceptions of trauma, that come from colonization.
Incredible. So I'm hearing also that that's where neuroplasticity comes in, right? The opportunity that we actually can change our brain. We can change our the neurons or the pathways in our brain through these mindfulness and contemplative practices.
Right. Absolutely.
Will you tell us a little bit how that works?
Yeah. So one of the things that, as I was saying earlier, that there's now people talk about expectation effects, which is part of the literature. I also know that one of the things that happens is that, people have, there's also introspection theory that's been talking about chatter in the brain. So there's these different beds of research that are happening when we think about people that have, this rumination, they call it, rumination. It's also called chatter. And that's been studied a lot. Like, why is this voice telling me that I'm not good enough, I'm not, this, I'm lacking, I have deficits, right? And we understand that from evolutionary biology, that was a survival mechanism, believe it or not, to kind of make sure that you stayed fit, make sure that you reminded yourself to kind of, be strong and to understand that there are challenges in life. But as we add an industrialized society then that has all these more messaging coming in, it overwhelms the brain, and that chatter gets stronger and stronger in the negative sort of side, the wise voice, that we have to kind of bring back in, that guides us, that usually came from, that was kind of, the conduits where our elders and ancestors and the wisdom that we held, isn't coming in as much as it did, because we have all these other kinds of spaces that are, that are opened up because of, the technology that we're being overwhelmed with, right? So what does it do then to our brain? Well, then it activates, or deactivates things like the temporal parietal junction that, is supposed to kind of give us a sense of emotional intelligence and a sense of well-being and a sense of being able to kind of control our emotional regulation, right? Becomes, it's not activated in the proper way, unless we're having this experience where we're more sort of connected, right, to one another, and we're feeling a sense of calm, where the other neurochemistry can kind of kick in. Our dopamine levels go up. We get a nice reward from having a nice sit and being in the space. Our levels of serotonin go up, and we have this really sort of relaxed experience, right? And it's the levels of oxytocin when you're meditating on something very sacred or special, or you're meditating with a song or a group, levels of oxytocin will go up, right? It's the bonding kind of chemical, and it's a strength chemical. It's an awareness chemical too, as well. It guides us. So there's really fundamental things that you do are things that provide a firewall against, some of these really detrimental parts, which are almost all detrimental parts in colonialism. So, and we see that in different kinds of things that happen in the brain, the activation that occurs. So it's something that I've looked at quite a bit. I mean, what we know about, for instance, about chronic stress and colonization is that one of the things it can do is it can break down in the prefrontal cortex what they call dendritic spines. And what dendritic spines are very important. They're very delicate. They look like little spines in our brain, but they're very delicate, and they're very important for sensory experience, for learning, and for memory. We know that people who are traumatized and colonialism keeps on throwing things at them day and and day and night, and then you've got the rumination going on. That this chronic stress then begins to release a chemical that floods into our brain. It's called protein kinase C, that breaks down these very delicate little spines, and then we start to lose some of our capacities for memory, for the sensory experience, for learning. We know that these dendritic spines in our brains also are a protective factor against neurodegenerative diseases like dementias and Alzheimer's. That's been studied, and we know that it's not all is lost here. We know that they can repair when the stress is eliminated, when you do things that are very mindful practices. Like I've identified 12 things in my research, like movement, running, singing, dancing, sleeping properly, exposing your body to mild bioenergetic stress, like sitting in cold, ice cold water, or sitting in a hot sauna. All those things have all these kind of accumulative effects, right? And that's that's just one of the things that happens with chronic stress. The other thing that happens too is that I call it colonizing the telomeres, which are at the end of the chromosomes. The more stress that we experience, long-term stress begins to degrade the chromosome, the telomeres at the end of the chromosome. And that's important because the telomeres at the end of the chromosome, kind of are an indicator of our health and wellness and longevity. And the more they shorten naturally just because we age, but the more they shorten, the quicker they shorten, leads to all kinds of chronic disorders, like cancers, diabetes, heart disease, obesity, hypertension. And of course, it leads to anxiety and depression disorders. So we know that, from research that's one of the things that happens too as well. We know that when we engage in practices, like I mentioned earlier, that are transformative, that are practices that help us sort of regain and restore our sense of self, that are ancient traditional practices that are important for us to do, that it raises the level of brain-derived neurotrophic factor in the brain. And that is a particular protein then that contributes to neurogenesis and the growth of new neurons in the brain. And it protects the existing neurons from dying and failing. And that not only meditation does it, but sitting in an ice cold pool of water for 5 minutes, or go for intermittent fasting every day for 18 hours, or going for a run or something, that kind of movement. BDNF is even raised by singing. And it also changes, again, that part of the brain where, the protection happens. Singing, dancing, in a traditional way, for long periods of time, like running, also raise endocannabinoids in the brain that also, protect the brain from dementias and from neurodegenerative diseases. But also it helps us feel better, improves our mood. It also blunts the pain. And it's very important for us to do. So all of these things I'm talking about have a very, very deep connection to the brain and body health. And what I'm talking about these aren't novel things. These are things that people have done for millennia. And Indigenous people in our part of the world, in Turtle Island, have been the people that have done them most recently, long before people imported like Western or Eastern sort of mindfulness practices here. Indigenous people were doing that. And of course, they were colonized and outlawed and banned. So, of course, you see what's happening with Indigenous people, higher levels of, disease and illness and so on, right? So you work with the prison populations. I've worked with prison populations too. And with max security in the United States at Fort Leavenworth. When I was a professor at the University of Kansas, I used to go visit the Indigenous men over there and talk to them about some of the things I'm talking about now, and about the importance of contemplative practices, sweat lodges, and ceremonial practices. These are critical for their health. But this is the first time some of them have ever done it when they were in prison, because it was taken away and destroyed, by colonialism and by settler, governments and laws and Christianity, those kinds of things.
Assimilation, right?
Yeah. Well,
Yep. Residential schools. There's such a history of violence in this country. And I think that we all continue to see and live through that. So thank you so much for your work and your study. Will you tell us about these Indigenous contemplative practices?
Sure. I mean, some of the practices are practices like there are. Would you mind if I put one up on the screen?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So when I talk about Indigenous contemplative practices, I'm talking about. Let me see if I can get it up here. Their screen is this one. Okay. So let me see if I can make this big and go to. So if you can see this here, I was talking about that.
So I can just see the top kind of bar of your screen.
Okay, let me see if I've got this in here. Share. Okay, it says it's paused. Let me see. Not sure why it's pausing. Strange, hasn't done that before. Let me stop the share and get back and try it again one more time. Stop the share. Okay. All right. Let's see here. All right. Let me know if you can see that.
Yes, we can see that now.
Okay. So, see if I can make this bigger. So, what I was talking about earlier were these different practices, all these things that grow the brain. And I've talked about 12 or different practices. But I mentioned earlier about endocannabinoid concentrations. These are Indigenous people in Northern California, where I used to live. We know that, when people involve themselves in these kind of mindful ceremonial dances, what it does, like I said, is it raises the level of endocannabinoids, in the brain, and it improves, the mood, as you see in the bottom, reduces stress and anxiety, enhances memory, protects brain function, reduces pain. So this is, something that's been picked up in Western science studies. If you go up here, you'll see that singing was one of the most beneficial and powerful activities, which is why, singing seems to raise endocannabinoids and makes people feel really well and healthy. What about dance? Well, dance, has these are Mandan dancers, buffalo dancers back in my part of the Great Plains area. They're traditional buffalo dance. All the tribes where I came from did buffalo dances. But we know that dance has this power, right, to improve memory, attention, and focus. And it also, this, ballroom dancing has been studied and it improves memory. And what Whip says down there is that dancing has also been important for survival and to help form bonds between people when times were very difficult. And that it's been a very universal aspect of our human experience, and our bodies and brains have evolved to dance in synchronized unison. So if you think about that, what affected Indigenous people is that, dancing was taken away, singing was taken away, language was taken away. And all of these kinds of things, as you can see from the neuroscience, we evolved to do that, and it changed the way we think and interact with one another, right? It's been a survival mechanism. What about singing? Singing, activates all these different circuits in the brain. Empathy circuits, when you sing. I just saw another study this morning about how singing, is a very powerful healing factor. Oxytocin, this bonding chemical, this aware chemical, this alive chemical, is secreted during singing together in groups. Cortisol levels are decreased. Language structures are activated, in call and response style when the leader sings a part of a song and everyone sings back to the leader, right? And reward, dopamine chemistry begins to improve, and people enjoy it. It makes the brain, it protects the brain, makes people stronger. And then, let's see here. These are from my community, Bear Society singers involved in a contemplative practice, right? They're singing. And they're singing on, the spirit of the bear, how the people are related to the bear, how we're related to the earth, all these parts of that. And their meditations are strength and courage to survive difficult times. This is why it was when colonization wiped out, those things that I'm saying, the Renaissance, there's a restoration of those kinds of things where people, connect to those other sentient beings that exist, like bears and animals, right? And what happens in the neuroscience is, of course, empathy goes up, oxytocin, dopamine, cortisol goes down, testosterone levels go up, right? These men are singing. Smudging does the same thing, plays a very important role in the psychophysiological activity of the brain, right? And we know that different fragrances that are very sacred to people activate, different parts of the cognitive function of the brain. And those have been studied, right? And they alter cognition, mood, and behavior. It makes people feel more sacred, more connected, more bonded. The mood improves, cognition clears, and people become more hopeful, right? This is why, it's very important for incarcerated populations to be able to smudge in prisons, right? For Indigenous people. Laughter is the same thing, right? Same thing. Indigenous people, we know that they are collectivist cultures. They carry more of this short allele of what they call the serotonin transporter gene, STG. It's called the 5-HTT-LPR. But if you look at Indigenous cultures across the many nations, you'll see that they have a much more frequency of that gene in those cultures, where that they're more, humor and smiling and jokes and happiness seem to make much more difference, right? If they flourish in a positive environment, Indigenous people do, where there's a lot of laughter, joking, sharing of food, pranks, funny storytelling. And that's why they had tricksters. That's why they had sacred clowns, right? And they really suffer much more than white people do or other people do that have a very, individualistic profile of genes and who are less sensitive to environmental conditions. We know that from the science, right? What does laughter do? Improves memory and learning, lowers cortisol, relaxes blood vessels, boosts T cells, raises endocannabinoids and BDNF, and protects the brain. Again, this is one of the things you'll see in the research and the literature, that why it was part of Indigenous cultures was humor was very, very important in many Indigenous cultures. They had to learn to laugh at death. They had to learn to laugh at hardship. They had to learn to laugh at themselves and be humble about that, right? And of course, this is one of the things that protected the brain. Buffalo dancers. And, we know people in a collective group, have a very different sort of perception and view and behavior. They can much more easily sacrifice individual benefits for the sake of the group and the group's progress, and less likely to betray members of the central in-groups, whereas it's very different with individual people. They're more likely to, go for their individual benefits and, of course, betray one another, right? So that's pretty clear. Fasting is another one. I don't know how much time we have, but it's one of those things, where I like to use this quote here from this Jesuit missionary, Paul Lejeune, who was among these Montagnais Indian hunter-gatherers in 1636. He was, proselytizing Christianity among them, and they had been without food for many days. And he saw them. He's writing in his journal as he's suffering. He hasn't eaten for a few days, and I saw them in their hardships and labors suffer with cheerfulness. Imagine that, people through hardships suffering with cheerfulness. Right now, I'm getting back to that gene, that serotonin transporter gene, that funny bone gene that enables us to laugh our way through that hardship. That Indigenous cultures have developed around the world. I found myself with them, threatened with great suffering. They said to me, and they're telling him, we shall be sometimes 2 days, sometimes 3, or even more without eating for lack of food. Take courage, Chini. Let thy soul be strong to endure suffering and hardship. Keep thyself from being sad, otherwise thou wilt be sick. See how we do not cease to laugh, even though we have little to eat. And this is how Indigenous people were. When you look at cultural neuroscience, this is how we developed in order to kind of be in our surroundings that were difficult. We couldn't be depressed or anxiety-ridden about it. We had to have this other part of ourself that was protecting us. And there's my hashtag, decolonize your need to feed. It's kind of one of the things I do because I'm a person that does a lot of fasting. So, if we get past that, this is another example of an Indigenous person from my tribe, Rickarat tribe in North Dakota. And he's meditating, on silence and the sacredness in front of him. So we know now that what's happening in his brain now, if we were to say, well, he's meditating on something that's very sacred and very important to him. What we notice here then is that, oops, I don't know why I'm not going backwards here. Go backwards, back to my other slide. What he's doing here is he's changing his brain here through this activity. And if you look at the baseline in the left prefrontal cortex, you can see that activity in the brain, that blood flow activity in the brain. And then if you look to the right side, you see the activity then during the meditation increase. So we know that when that increases, that in the brain, what's happening in the brain is feelings of happiness, joy, optimism, feelings of well-being, right? Just by looking at this very sacred object. And of course, when you look at Indigenous people and what happened to them, their sacred objects were taken away, right? And then the back of his brain, you also see the occipital lobe, and it's changed somewhat. The occipital lobe is the seeing part of the brain, where it's activated and gotten a little bit redder and more connected. That seeing part of the brain helps him to kind of see beyond the pipes. He sees the ancestors. He sees maybe the songs that were sung. He's hearing that, the words. He's seeing where the stems were gathered from the pipes and where the pipestone came from, and the ceremonies and the songs that went to creating these very sacred things, right? And that's how the brain changes in that sense. So we know that when people go into these states, very deep states, using these contemplative Indigenous practices, that they develop a oneness with all living things, just like the Buddha did. The Buddha found enlightenment sitting under the Bodhi tree, and he had to sit there for several days. And of course, he was meditating before that. But this guy, Andrew Newberg, scanned these brains of nuns and these Buddhists, who are undergoing these transformative experiences and transcendental experiences. And each time you could see that in the brain, they were experiencing spacelessness, meaning that they had no limits anymore, right? That they could touch everything and everything was touching them. their self-transcendence, where they sort of moved out of being a space of being human, and they could see more deeply in a more enlightened way. And the parietal lobe in the brain is this area of the brain that's responsible for spatial visual reasoning, but also perceiving the world in three dimensions, right? But when you get to the space, when you're meditating very deeply and doing these indigenous practices, you experience this sense of unity, right, with all living things, because the activity of that parietal lobe has sort of gone offline, which is happening in this particular indigenous practice here. These Irikara men from my tribe back in about 1903 were allowed to kind of do this ceremony over again. And they go back here again, sorry, the sun. And they're singing to this tree and acknowledging this tree and the sacredness of this tree as a mother. And they sing these songs, they do it for long, long periods of time, right? And then in order to get to that place, like the nuns and the Buddhist monks did, and like these indigenous people do, it takes it's not just a workshop, a weekend, or it's not just, a few hundred hours or whatever, it's thousands of hours we know now. And once that happens, you see the parietal lobe in the area there that Newberg was talking about. Once that goes offline, you experience this spacelessness, this timelessness that's connected to all things. And of course, the line between the tree and the men here becomes blurred. There are no longer the men. That's no longer the tree. That's no longer the mother. That's no longer the grandmother. They become part of the tree. That's when the connection is made. They are the branches. They are the fragrance. They are the roots. They are the bark and all of its sensations and fragrance and all of its feeling. They become part of it. So now we know how the Buddha achieved his connection and oneness with the planet, right? Indigenous people have been doing that, long before Eastern meditation practices have come here, but they were just outlawed, and that was the colonization. They were banned, they were taken away, they were ridiculed, marginalized. So that's kind of an example. Here we see it in the modern day sort of Sundance, the same thing happening. And again, this man here is sitting, this is an Arikara man back in one of our sacred medicine lodges back in about 1903. So you see him, he could be, he could be a Tibetan, monk, or he could be a yogi or someplace, practicing there in his place. So here we see, all these things that, sorry, it's going too fast here. The insula here that I was talking about earlier, the brain waves that are changing. And of course, we see now that, Daniel Goleman and people like Richard Davidson are writing about, how these things change in the brain, and they're from the brain scans. But we know that from indigenous traditional knowledge, we knew that was happening. The brain was changing, the body, the spirit, the emotions, the cells, the molecular structures were changing. But, it's that people were prevented, and banned from doing those kinds of practices. So what we know is that all these different kinds of things lead to resilience. Everything I've been talking about, all this indigenous way of mindfulness and neurodecolonization lead to resilience. And we're seeing two brains here, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex on the left, when it's active and it's protecting the brain, and the risky sort of, when it's not, activated. We know that cognitive resilience lives in this part of the brain, and it's important for our cognitive functioning. We know that prior experience is very important to train the person for high levels of uncertainty. And we know that this is what indigenous people did to young men and young women during their rites of passage. They challenged them in all these different kinds of ways that I'm talking about. What we know about that is that, it's located in the prefrontal cortex, this part of the brain. It's also located in the frontal lobe, kind of at the underside of the cerebral hemispheres. And it's implicated in healthy risk-taking and not being too fearful, but being brave, right? There's also what they call brave cells that exist in the brain that sort of interact with this too as well. That's been studied. It's also plays an important role in inhibition of emotional responses that, the warrior, the strong, woman, the stoic person people used to laugh about. And it's probably very true that people had to kind of be very cool and calm and not let their emotions get out of control. But it's also, implicated in healthy decision-making and self-control. And finally, the last part is that I really think is important is that it's involved in the cognitive evaluation of morality, that we do the right thing. that we engage in the right practices. Like Buddhism says, the eightfold path is the right speech, the right thinking, the right mind, right, the right job, all these different kinds of things that are right. So these are things that I relate to neurodecolonization. So I'll just stop there. That's the end of it. So.
Thank you so much for crafting this for us. Maybe could we get a copy of this too? So anyone listening later might be able to spend more time with it. This is incredible.
Sure.
Yeah, people are hoping these slides will be available. We can do that. Just really sitting with the impact of thousands and thousands of years of these practices of resilience and contemplation and the trauma of them being ripped away. I think I just want to ask maybe one more question before we dive into community questions. I would love to hear maybe stories or the impact of bringing these practices to incarcerated Indigenous individuals as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, change happens quick, right? I mean, when you engage in these practices, the brain has that way to kind of compensate to create the plasticity that you need to do these kinds of things. We know from prison, mindfulness programs like doing Vipassana, doing time, that movie there, if you saw that one, or Dharma Brothers, we can see how quickly it takes, some weeks for people to begin shifting, the plasticity in the brain and the emotions to go with that. But when you add to this kind of thing, just the mindfulness, you add to it, mindful running, other kinds of things that I've talked about, here, and you can activate, more of the receptors and networks in the brain, as well as you can increase, the expression of these different neurochemicals as well. So, using smudge, all those kinds of things. The biggest part of I think, or one of the biggest parts of it is understanding that these things make a difference, that you're not just waiting for it to, kind of like all of a sudden you get the aha moment, but you're actually building upon that when you engage in these kinds of practices, and why they're important. Plasticity happens, very quickly, as I showed that picture of the dendritic spines. They start to repair pretty quickly, when people begin to move toxic stress out of their lives and engage in things that are very, calming and contemplative, right? Same thing happens when people run, if people are incarcerated, if they just, jog and get their heart rate up to a certain level, they begin to change their expression of what's known as cururinine, which is an enzyme in the body that if we sit too long, too much, it can become toxic. But endurance running at a slow pace, let's say at 6 miles an hour or whatever, I'm just kind of throwing that out because that's kind of what, people kind of 10 minutes a mile, but, even slower, like 12 minutes a mile, just moving along at a nice slow pace for a long period of time is going to change the expression of cururinine from the toxic cururinine into curinetic acid, which helps, build a firewall against depression and anxiety. That's why, again, we see so much depression and anxiety. We don't move like we used to. And when you take a population and you put them in the prison and you don't allow them to move, of course they're going to get anxiety. Of course, this curinetic acid is going to be absent from their body, and they're going to have the toxic, CAT, K-A-T, curinine aminotransferase is going to build up in the body and turn to what they call, trying to remember the other term, but anyway, it turns into, curinetic acid then once you start moving, right? That's very important, so mindfulness to me is not just about sitting on a cushion. It's about doing all these things that are very traditional indigenous practices, so.
Thank you. I can't wait to sit with all of this for longer as well. I do have one more question before we dive into our community. A lot of topics around the Westernization of yoga and mindfulness practices. Could you give us some best practices for not appropriating culture, not appropriating practices? How do we stay in right relationship with these practices? from your perspective?
I don't know. I mean, maybe that horse is already out of the barn. I don't know. I mean, people have imported them and used them, and then they've changed them in so many ways, right? And when you talk to folks, they'll say, well, it wasn't really meant to kind of do it this and do it that way. It was kind of more about enlightenment. And I think that's kind of one of the things that's happened with a lot of these things, is that the spiritual aspects have gone out of them and they've become just generally, just for public use, right? They're kind of secular in that sense, right? So I think that's the thing, is that, it's very hard to create a movement or to create change without spirituality and connection at a spiritual level. And that takes time, and it takes, courage to build it. It takes risks. It takes good teachers that are willing to kind of lead people through that process of developing that sense of connection to spirit and spirituality. And, and I understand why people do it now in Western world, because we live in a very toxic environment in an industrial society that, extracts and appropriates from every one of us our energy, our words, our memory. Anything that we can give to it, it extracts it from us, and then it throws back at us everything that it thinks that we need to know, in all these different levels. So then we're exposed to war, we're exposed to all these different kinds of uncertainties and fears. I mean, people live in society, fear of losing their job, fear of losing their transportation, their car, fear of losing their paycheck so they can't eat, fear of losing their health care, their fear of losing their life, the fear of sending their kids to school that they might get shot down. No, they should be fearful of going to the bar or the bowling alley when people, will commit mass murders there. So there's this fear in an industrialized society that's absent from spirituality. There's a lot of religion there, but there's not a lot of spirituality there that says, everything is important. And I don't know if I mentioned it here or earlier, that in our brain, that anterior cingulate cortex, right? It's we don't activate it. Many times people live in that space of a God that's a fearful God, a God that's a God of retribution, a God that's a God of, distancing, right? We know that lights up the fear part of the brain. It's harder for us to kind of accept others, to accept diverse ideas, to love the trees, to love the planet, to love one another. If we have a God that's a God of benevolence, that God says, love everything. Love everyone around you. Love those res dogs. Love that water. Love that air. Love that land, and care about things. That activates that compassionate part of the brain, the anterior cingulate cortex. And so that's what we're living in, a society that's a fear-based society, fearful of everything. And it's a society of individualism that's really strong. It's so strong right now. And we were, we didn't come that way. We came as collectivist societies. We came as societies that had a relationship with the earth, with the water, with the spirits of the forests and the trees and the mountains, that had respect. We've lost that. And so we're in that place where we're struggling. And so I understand that the appropriation and the use of these practices from someone else is necessary to kind of help calm this craziness and this fear that exists, just so widespread. It's so, epigenetically in our environment. Who doesn't live without fear, right? You drive down the road and you could get assaulted, in a road rage incident. You could go into a parking lot and try to, take a spot and get assaulted or shot by someone who wants the same parking spot. It's all about me and individual. So it's about the fear that exists. So all these aspects are sort of floating out there. So I understand perfectly where people are trying to find a drug or a practice or something to find relief from this toxic industrialized society we live in, right? So.
Thank you for speaking so succinctly to something I think all of us feel leaving the house, going anywhere. And maybe this is just particularly people who live in the United States. I know we have an international audience, but it's true. The violence is everywhere.
Yeah.
So at this time, I welcome our audience to start to drop in their questions as well. This is one of the benefits of joining us live, is that you get to connect directly with our guest. We do have one question, and I'll pitch it to you. They say, "Good morning. so grateful to sit with your Dharma talk. This is Do. She's a student of the Community Health Outreach Worker Training Program at Arizona State University. She's asking if there's any workshops, studies, teachers, any programs on neuroscience, either online or in person. So I think generally is if someone is interested in learning and engaging with this work more, how can we stay connected to you and how can we stay connected to this work?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of stuff that's being published. You have to just sort of look for it, right? There's some books that are published, right? I'm not sure they get to the same thing that I'm talking about in terms of the fear and the toxicity of industrial society. I think to talk more kind of generally about the symptoms that exist and not the root cause of the problems. So that's first of all my work. I haven't really published a lot of my work yet. I published some. This talk that I've just given is a book that I'm working on right now. And I'm going more in depth into this to kind of talk a lot more about, different parts of the brain and incorporate a lot more things about genetics in the talk too as well, which I generally do, and how those kind of play into it, in terms of the practices. And I use a medicine wheel to kind of look at the neuroplasticity, the mind, and of course, neurogenesis. I look at the body part of this, in the medicine, we'll have to look at, what happens to our body, what happens to our telomeres, what happens to our gut biome, what happens to all these really important things, the psychology that lives inside of us. And then go into this next sector, which is the spiritual part, which are our mindfulness practices, our meditative practices. And the last part is sort of the emotions, which is related a lot to genetics and epigenetic sort of research and stuff that's been going on. So I don't know of anyone that's put anything that comprehensive together. I can't say I'm the first to do it. I don't know, but I'm hoping that the work that I do it will be meaningful. But it's I think that kind of thing, because people live in an industrial supply society, and it's for so many we don't think about it, that it's become very natural to kind of have these fears and to entertain this kind of vulnerability and to kind of think it's normal, right? People are thinking it's normal, like in the United States now, that you have gun violence every week where, multiple people are killed. It's like people are getting, very, it's like the trauma physician after a while, it's like, it just doesn't register emotionally anymore, but it's doing things to us, kind of at a molecular level, colonizing us at a molecular level. So,
just sitting with that. You had mentioned before too, and you talked about it a little bit in this conversation, the topic of neurotheology. And so how the quality of the God that you perceive or believe impacts your brain. And you had mentioned that there was a book that people could read, and I purchased it as well. Could you say the name of that book again?
Yes, How God Changes Your Brain. And it's by Andrew Newberg. I forget the second author. That's the issue, right? Second author, but it's called God Changes Your Brain. I'm not sure what he's written lately, but it's a really good primer to kind of give you an idea about what I was talking about. These different gods that we envision, and most people kind of believe in. The critical, the distant, or the God of retribution. There's not. There's only maybe 20%, I think, in the studies he looked at, maybe 22% or somewhere 25%, that people that believe in a benevolent God. And of course, that makes a big difference in society. If you have a God that says, love everybody and love everyone and love yourself, that brings down the level of war, of conflict. It increases and releases, love and kindness and compassion, cooperation, and it's very different, more acceptance and a more openness to diverse ideas and diverse people and diverse ways of thinking and knowing, right? Whereas the other kinds of belief in the God kind of begin to shut that down. So.
Thank you. I wanted to share that with our audience as well, if they're looking to continue to dive into these topics. And I also want to say that we would love to have you back when this book is out. We can do a launch and a release, invite our community, and I'll make sure that the technology is sorted by then as well. But congratulations. And I'm really excited about your book.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. So maybe as our community starts to drop in some questions, a question from Claudia. Do you have recommendations for the amount of practice required to change the brain? Would 10 minutes daily be enough? Is once a week enough?
Yeah, it's interesting because there's even some research that I look at in terms of Richard Davidson and Daniel Goleman's work. Let me see if I can bring it up again here real quickly. I'll see if I've got it in this particular slide here. Yeah, it's interesting because that's a great question, because if you want to know the answer to that, it's like, what is it? What is it? And what does it mean, in regards to how much practice we need to do? So let me just see if I can pull it up real quickly. I was rather impressed that these studies have been done, and it's not it. So let me look at that one here. That's the wrong one. Sorry, I'm looking for it right now. So I'll give you kind of an idea. I'm finding it right now, but what they have is looked at is like within 100 hours of practice, you begin to change the white matter in the brain, better connectivity. You begin to you lower your threshold of anxiety, and those kinds of things begin to come down. Then they jump up to 1,000 hours. 1,000 hours then of practice. Think about that. If you practice 2 hours a day, and there are 365 days, in the year, and you're practicing 2 hours a day, that's going to get you, over 700,000 or 700 hours of practice, between 700 and 800 hours of practice. That's still not quite 1,000 hours, but you're moving in that direction. But 1,000 hours of practice is going to, begin to, again, really lower, your stress and anxiety. Emotional control is better. And I think it's at 1,000 hours when, the part of your brain that is the me part of the brain. I'm just trying to remember the part of the brain that begins to kind of tamper down. It becomes more like, I'm thinking more about we, right? So and then of course when you move to 5,000 hours, then that becomes even more pronounced. That the default mode network where your brain is all over the place, the monkey mind, then begins to really sort of focus after 5,000 hours of practice. And then when you then that other part of the brain, really begins. Sorry, I'm forgetting the name of it. Begins to silence, and then all of a sudden, it's like, wow, it's more about we. It's more about we. It's more about us. It's that identification with self begins to fade away. Like these guys that were in front of that tree, they were singing to the tree, the mother, the grandmother that represented, the female entity in my tribe. As that, became more and more apparent to them, and the parietal lobe went offline after 5,000 hours of singing in front of the tree. I'll just say, I don't know if that's what it was, but they begin to have that experience where, they start feeling a sense of transcendence. And they began to go beyond themselves and connect to that tree and understand that tree. The tree understood them, right? There was that sentience. And when you reach 10,000 hours of practice, it's pretty incredible what's happening to the brain by then. It's that you're developing brain waves where you're moving into what they call gamma waves, which is a very, very sort of almost like a straight line, but a little sort of movement in your brain. The modulation is very fine at that point. And research is now showing that when you reach a level of a gamma wave in your brain wave, that your brain becomes maximally sensitive. It's like sensing and feeling and tasting and touching and experiencing things that you wouldn't have ever experienced before. It's kind of a very transcendent experience, right? The brain goes into what they call a low or no power function, where your brain is just there, kind of, it's not using this energy. So you can function like that in long, long periods of time, which, yogis have done. You see pictures and they've been meditating for like 30 days. They maybe stop and get a drink after a few days or whatever. And the systems are all closed down, like going into a state of hibernation, right? But that brain is kind of at that level. And then that's a high level of creativity, a very, very high level of creativity. You get beyond and transcendent in I just imagine that your brain opens up and the links one that was kind of holding in, the learning begins to relax, and your brain becomes much and more and begins to connect to these other things. This is where neuroscience kind of gets off the plane here, though. They don't want to talk about the experiences that are are spiritual experiences. They don't want to talk about that. But then most of you talk about some of these people that are Rinpoches. They will talk about it and say, yeah, that's when those things start to happen. You start to have these very, very deep, rich, spiritual experiences, right? Where you're in, this transcendence, from this place, you're in a very different world. So that's like 10,000 hours of practice. So it's that's kind of where it is. So, and it's like anything, you can miss a couple of days, but you don't want to miss too many days. You want to keep it consistent, it's consistent. And the thing is, it's like everything else, you're always coming back to the breath, coming back to the breath. And after a while, maybe it's coming back to the object, like the sacred pipe or whatever it is, right? But as you build up your hours, right? And then it's like lifting weights. I strength train every day. I do bench press, 2 times a week, and I do overhead lifts 2 times a week, right? That's enough, right? If I did it, 3 days a week, would that be enough? Well, maybe I'll injure myself, or maybe I won't want to do it anymore. So you have to find your space where it feels good and where it feels natural. And it doesn't always feel good and natural. Sometimes you have to build into that space before it comes like that. So
thank you. Thank you for your answer. Thank you for that question. Practice deeply, practice often. We have another question from our community. How might Indigenous practices speak to bitterness, deprivation, and isolation in moments of suffering for incarcerated people?
I think, it's the idea that I think, again, knowing that the practices, are very ancient, right? And I think that's the thing, is to give people context. These things were around when things were very difficult. Not only people were incarcerated, but they had to deal with climate change, they had to deal with starvation, they had to deal with war, they had to deal with this uncertainty. They weren't in. So those kinds of practices, are very important to remind people that there's the context of where they took place, where they came from. They came from people that sacrificed their time to come up with a practice, to come up with a procedure or a process that would help relieve the spirit of suffering. But also, it's really important to remember that with Indigenous people too. I just gave a talk this morning to another big group of people online about they were asking about Buddha Dharma, and I said, well, Buddha Dharma, and I said, well, the idea is that you want to relieve suffering, right? You want to, and you've got the noble truths and the eightfold path and all that. I said, but there's a lot of Indigenous people too that invited suffering into their life in order to experience and understand, how it feels, for other people, and how that suffering is not only in human beings, but it's on the planet, it's in the water, it's in the trees, it's in the ground, it's in the minerals that are extracted, it's in the space, it's all these different places, right? Even Buddha said that. So Buddha said that even the gods suffer, So that's the kind of thing, is to remember that suffering is a universal kind of thing, but it's our choice of how much we want to suffer with that. So that's what mindfulness is really good for. It helps us to kind of center and to refocus, right? So that's the first thing. That's good for us because it helps us to kind of shut off and prune some of those overactive neural networks that are around bitterness, that are around fear, that are around all these deprivation, right, isolation, those kinds of things. So, but it's the idea though that that what's the next aspect of it? There are the different practices that have to be brought in that are very different. Decolonize, what I call mindful decolonization. How does one engage in practices that help purify you from that kind of thing? Then how do you restore in your mind and in your body those songs, those ideas, those beliefs, those values, those symbols, right? We know that Indigenous people have learned songs from the wind, from the rustle of the trees. They've learned song from the clouds. The clouds speak to them. They've learned songs from insects. They've learned songs from animals. The Northwest Coast, people know the song of the whale. In the central U.S., people know the song, of swans and of birds, that sort of thing, and so on. These are who we are. That song is out there with the ancestors, always waiting to make itself known to us. And this is what I've learned, as I was growing up, and the many years I've been a sun dancer and had a lot of teachers that said, you draw from these places. The planet is rich with those things if you allow that to come. And of course, as you reach those different states of practice, you have that experience after 5,000-10,000 hours of practice that you're in a place of transcendence, and the brain, begins to pick up things that you don't normally see, feel, hear, sense, taste, or touch. Right? That's the thing about it, is to remember that it's a practice in moving in toward that place. It's always practice moving towards that place, right? And that's the encouragement you want to give folks, is that, it's a journey. It's like for every one of us, we're all incarcerated in our own way, right? We're all incarcerated in our own way. So it's a journey for us, We just live in a different kind of prison, Some say it was with golden bars or whatever it is, the prison of our minds, the prison of our heart, the prison of our, hope and our optimism, all those things can be colonized. So.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today, for sharing the amazing slideshow, for sharing your work and your wisdom and your understandings. I just want to give you an opportunity to speak to anything that hasn't been said or any last words for our community.
Oh, I don't really have anything else to say, but, just continue your practice. Practice hard, practice with intention, with good intention, and practice with courage, so that, you are able to build up your resilience to engage, beyond the cushion, to engage in the world and have the courage and the insight, and the intelligence to speak to these kinds of things that need to be spoken to, right? And to encourage, but also to be a beacon for others, right? That you can provide some kind of mentoring for others. It's like the Buddha. When the Buddha saw the dead person, the old person, the sick person, he was inspired most by this person that was the sadhu, who was poor, who was ragged, who was moving along impoverished on the road, but yet smiling and beaming because this person had transcended the suffering here. And even the sight of that person was a healing sort of, symbolic thing. He didn't have to do anything but show that his brightness and his sacrifice was a healing, and it gave people hope. And imagine giving people hope and then engaging along with that to do something. That twofold kind of thing can lead to, a lot of good stuff. So that's what I would say to folks.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.